So I have titled my presentation Scarring Innocence in an ode to the moral incentive to be against circumcision, and that this moral incentive is enough. So without further ado, Scarring Innocence. Those of us who oppose genital mutilation often find ourselves on the defense in the framing of our argument for why we ought to keep baby boys intact. We are put in a position where it is assumed that we must be the ones to defend our point of view on the issue, solely based on the predication of circumcision being widely accepted within the United States. This has been an unreasonable assumption for supporters of circumcision to make of us, those who are against it, and an irrational position for us to take in the debate, considering that to circumcise an infant meets the definition of genital mutilation, which is defined as any type of cutting or removal of all or some of the genital organs. When we put the word female in front of genital mutilation, it elicits an extremely distressed response from different cultural groups and demographics around the world, as it rightfully should. I mean, the abuse is in the name, right? Mutilation is mutilation, and female circumcision has been banned in majority of Western nations, including our own. But for some reason, when we disguise this barbaric practice equivalent in its violation to the bodies of vulnerable infant males under the medically accepted terminology of routine infant circumcision, somehow the devastated response we would expect to receive over this torturous procedure becomes lost in translation through this thought-altering doublespeak. The medicalization became the moralization of genital mutilation. Because of this lost in translation doublespeak phenomenon, I find myself in a circular back and forth battle of purveying the medical proof that circumcision is an unnecessary procedure when confronting someone who supports it. And in this bid to logic, I can't help but feel that exposing the blatant cruelty and saddening torment of what is done to a male infant during circumcision becomes overshadowed by this need to appeal to the science behind foreskin's functionality and overall benefit to the male body. When I take a step back, I find myself reeling with frustration from how absurd it is that I even have to pull up the evidence to prove that the genital mutilation of an infant is never a just action. The medical data matters with the implication that it allows us to debunk misconceptions and truly understand the functionality of foreskin. But from a moral standpoint, using the facts and data to defend why a child shouldn't be abused and mutilated is a negligible point, because even without the data to back up foreskin's functionality or research, our conviction would still logically stand on its own with just as much coherence. 2 words: bodily autonomy. Let me put it this way. Should I have to explain the function of my future child's fingers to defend why they shouldn't be cut off? What about my future daughter? Should I have to explain the anatomical necessity and purpose of her female genitalia in order to know that this part of her body deserves to be left alone? Do I have to play a game of count the nerve endings to justify why her body, her innocence, and her trust in her caretakers deserves to remain intact? Why can't this sentiment be held with the same priority for male or intersex children within the United States? Why is foreskin the only part of a human, and of an infant human nonetheless, that we must vehemently defend with empirical evidence of its functionality in order for it to be left on the body of the person who it belongs to? Why should we have to make an argument for why brutally torturing and sexually assaulting a newborn is not ethical? I'm wearing this shirt that says, "Say no to circumcision, research the facts," but the irony of it is that the most glaringly obvious fact has less to do with the function of the foreskin, and trust me, I'm by no means trying to downplay how vital this sexual tissue is, but the fact that is the most glaringly obvious is the strikingly simple observation of irreversible and severe harm being done to a non-consenting child on one of the most sensitive and personal parts of his body. This principle of protecting another's right to bodily autonomy reflected in patient autonomy, or so you would think, would apply the same to any part of the body we would deem essential for day-to-day life. And it's quite astounding the mental gymnastics people are willing to put themselves through as they painstakingly quantify what kind of genital cutting is worthy of praise and worthy of contempt. Maybe this praise is coming from the misnomer of circumcision being commonly referred to as a standard medical procedure. Well, let's take a look at what a standard medical procedure is. The NIH defines a standard medical procedure as treatment that is accepted by medical experts as a proper treatment for a certain type of disease, and that is widely used by healthcare professionals, also called best practice, standard of care, and standard therapy. Now, it doesn't make much sense at all, then, to refer to circumcision as a standard medical procedure. As a publication by doctors opposing circumcision so evidently put it, no penile disease is present in healthy newborn male infants, and therefore no therapeutic action, and certainly no amputative surgery is required. No medical organization in the world, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, recommends circumcision as a routine procedure for all male infants. As an elective procedure, non-therapeutic circumcision cannot be considered the proper or most conservative standard of care for a healthy minor. On the contrary, when we take a look at the definition of child abuse, it is defined by federal and state law under the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act as any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caregiver that results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act that presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Isn't it disturbing how our own federal law puts plainly what child abuse is, bans female circumcision over 20 years ago, and yet our esteemed medical monoliths and governmental agencies can't seem to put their heads together to make sense of how circumcision checks not one, but almost all of the boxes used to legally describe child abuse? It is past time to flip the script on the narrative surrounding the circumcision debate by speaking in total confidence of the objective moral truth being on our side. We can reshape the collective outlook on circumcision by being as transparent and as objective as possible by calling circumcision what it really is, which is genital mutilation and severe child abuse. While it may be initially shocking for a majority of people to hear circumcision referred to in this way, I have also found it to be the most cogent and correct way of describing it. How can someone argue with what is irrefutably true? I see no need to dance around with doublespeak or tiptoe around people's factually incorrect notions of what circumcision is or its mythological benefits. Pretending that circumcision is anything other than physical, sexual, and psychological harm to a child will only hurt our mission in the long run by framing the circumcision debate in such a way that allows people to remain complicit in their ignorance and entitled in their choice to make excuses for an abhorrent cruelty targeted at the most defenseless demographic of our population. Remaining as objective as possible in our endeavor to convince others to connect the dots in associating the action of circumcising a male infant with the action of genital mutilation is a natural result that I've personally witnessed to occur by asking the simple questions, because these two things are quite literally the same exact thing. In our conversations with others, we might ask, can genital mutilation be considered healthcare? In what scenario is robbing a child of their sexual anatomy ethical or justifiable? Should children have a voice in decisions regarding the removal of their healthy anatomy? Should it be legal for a child to undergo a non-therapeutic elective cosmetic procedure at the request of their parents? We'll find that most people who defend the legal genital mutilation of male infants will not have impartial answers for these questions. Their only defense can be attributed to their personal preference or lack of awareness. Candid questions paired with an honest evaluation of what happens during routine infant circumcision inevitably exposes the callous disregard for a child's safety, well-being, and right to bodily autonomy. The violent act of circumcision in itself is enough reason for it to be rejected by our population beyond the obvious facts for why it is not medically necessary and damaging to the child's genitalia, as well as his psychological health. And that is what I'm trying to get at in both this presentation and in my own activism when someone I know becomes pregnant with a son. I would argue that the reason for circumcision's existence in the first place comes from a complete lack of respect for a child's body and their inherent right to be free from abuse at the hands of those who have more power than them. When it comes to soon-to-be parents or your everyday person, most people defend circumcision from a place of blissful ignorance and conditioned comfort. They don't know the excruciating pain, loss, and trauma an infant experiences when being circumcised. But curious minds beg to be informed. I once too didn't question circumcision, and if it weren't for my oldest sister's intuitive need to do what is best for her children, and therefore do her due diligence in researching all of the medical care recommended to her, which included circumcision, I would have never known how awful routine infant circumcision is, and I would have never had the opportunity to share what I learned from her with my friends and classmates in college. So a special thank you to my sister Rachel, who is on the left with her family, and she is the mother of 3 intact sons and 1 daughter. I know that my presentation may have come across as an oversimplification of the issue at hand, but from where I stand currently and in my more recent personal experiences, breaking down the oppositional argument is simple on an individual basis. And I believe it is through individuals that we can make the biggest difference. I was young when my eyes were open to what circumcision is, and I didn't have a world of knowledge or a degree under my belt, but I still recognized rather quickly that it was inhumane, and many of the world's governing medical bodies concurred. The endorsement for intactivism is simple because it's just the simple truth. There is absolutely no need to cut up the genitals of a baby, and to do so is child abuse. A keynote that I hope you all will take away with you is that asserting your moral authority on the topic of genital mutilation is not an illogical way to go about arguing against it. You have every right to make your moral principle the focus of your argument. Harming a child by forcefully removing a healthy, functioning part of their body is never okay. And I would allege further that diagnosing foreskin as inherently defective or disease-ridden is complete medical insanity, manifesting as some form of Munchausen syndrome. I don't need to quote any doctor, government agency, healthcare organization, or human rights group to assert the claim that is on this slide. Objective moral truth does exist, and it is not relative to time period, culture, religion, or rule books. I know that might be an unpopular opinion, but when it comes to observing an abuse of human rights, disfiguring a vulnerable child, leaving them permanently damaged, not only physically but psychologically, that is about as objectively wrong as it gets. This isn't nuanced, this doesn't have a gray area, and if we were talking about female genital mutilation, none of what I'm saying would be taken as controversial or extreme within Western allopathic medicine. Approaching the topic of circumcision with those who have never been confronted with the truth of it takes patience, but I believe there is nothing more convincing than to assert our moral authority on this resoundingly deplorable abuse of human rights. If the top medical schools and establishments in the United States are so convinced this is the best choice for males, why not let those males make that decision themselves once they are of a mature mental age, rather than scarring their innocence before they even have the opportunity to speak up for themselves or recognize the innate right they have to an intact body, which includes all of their sexual anatomy. Thank you so much for listening.
Any question?
So maybe you can help me out here with a question that I get a lot, and I'll play devil's advocate here and see if you can help. But when I discuss male genital mutilation, and I vehemently oppose using the term circumcision, I think that it normalizes an incredibly abhorrent procedure. One of the things that I'm often the responses that I get is, well, what about ear pinning? So kids are born with very prominent ears, and ear pinning is somewhat common. It is cosmetic, it's elective, and I'm less opposed to it. I'm not sure I can articulate why, but you seem to have thought things out really well, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the subject.
Yeah, I've honestly never heard of ear pinning. I would say that anything that is cosmetic, I just think it's safest to go, I mean, it's rather to be safe than sorry, anything that's cosmetic, because then people can make arguments for, you know, oh, my 13-year-old doesn't like the way their nose looks, or, you know, you can just take it to those places where it's like, why not just wait until they're 18, until they're of, well, I guess everyone has considered to be a mature mental age to make those sort of decisions. That is a permanent procedure on their body. I would agree with you, though. It's obviously not as like severe as genital mutilation, but yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. I'll have to look it up.
Anybody else?
I'm going to venture a guess that the what about ear pinning is a question that someone who's defensive and doesn't like the argument about circumcision is bringing up. You know, well, what about ear piercing? What about ear, you know, you're really in a conversation at that point where they've taken you off track, right? I mean, how many discussions about ear pinning are we having, you know, right? It's not, and also it's not a functional intervention, right? I'm not saying I'm defending it, but yeah, it's a logical fallacy, right? I mean, so yes, right. I'm just going to take the opportunity to have the microphone. Doesn't mean we can't take more questions. We will need maybe right now a show of hands of the number of people who might want to eat downstairs tonight. You're not committing yourself, but we want to give them enough information so they might have enough staff. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish. Yeah. What? Count you as two. Okay. Can somebody count this? I'm terrible at this. Like 1. Yeah. Yeah, we do. No, we do. Oh, Kelly, I'm sorry. I meant to say we have time for a few more questions. We still have 9 minutes. So if anybody has questions, no, we're putting you back up there. Yeah, you put the mic after the person asks a question, right?
It's really not a question, it's a comment. I just wanted to, I'm right over here.
Oh, sorry, I'm like, where's it coming from?
I just wanted to congratulate you, given that you're new to this issue and articulating so well the issues surrounding circumcision.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. My sister had her first son 5 years ago, so it's been almost 6 years that I've been, you know, thinking about it, talking about it, because that's when she started to do the research and totally cued me in, like, isn't this crazy? And I was like, my mind was blown. Honestly, like, my mind was genuinely blown. Thank you.
I'm gonna get there soon.
So you said that you spoke with people at your university about this.
Mm-hmm.
What was at Georgia State?
Mm-hmm.
What was kind of the reaction from that demographic from like 19 to 21 when you broached the topic?
I had an extremely positive reaction. I felt like, especially from women, like, I don't know if it was because I'm also female, but a lot of times after presentations, I did like a handful of presentations on circumcision when we had an option to speak about a topic that interested us. But yeah, a lot of people would come up to me after the presentation just with that same reaction that I had when I was like 16 learning about it. They were like, I had no idea, like, this is insane. Like, you know, thank you. I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna research more. I had professors also who were a bit like, oh, are you sure you want to do this topic? And then like after I would give the presentation or whatever, they would be very like, you did a good job. You know, but professors that I kind of felt like might be like eyeballing the topic. But I like to think that I planted seeds in their head.
Hi. On the subject of whataboutism, Georgianne touched on this, but whataboutism is a whole class of rhetoric unto itself. And when somebody starts a question with what about, you should just, I deflect them to, I just say this is deflection. On the subject of terminology, words like amputation, mutilation, disfigurement, I too use those phrases. I don't often use the word circumcision because people think they know what it means. But many among us, they back off. They want to use more neutral, less inflammatory terms, because the more inflammatory terms sometimes put people off, especially people who have given the order for their own sons. Have you experienced? What's your opinion on that? On using the harsh language versus the softer terms? And have you noticed a difference when you talk to maybe younger people, 18s, 19s, 20s, 21s, who have not given the order yet, or when you talk to older people who, have some responsibility?
Yeah, I would say that I mostly have spoken to a younger demographic around my age, and I guess I am using the inflammatory words, but I don't even see them as inflammatory because they're just honest. Like, it's not really like, I feel like it's not, if someone sees those words as being inflammatory, like they're projecting that kind of onto me because they're just honest. Like, it is disfigurement, it is genital mutilation, and I feel like that using these words makes it harder for people to argue. When you dance around using these words, it's like, oh, well, yeah, no, yeah, it's just a preference. It's, it's like, no, like, use these words so it gets into people's head that, like, this is the exact same thing as female genital mutilation. You think so poorly of female genital mutilation. You think the countries and cultures that practice it are so barbaric, but you're not even willing to reflect on how this is the same exact thing. So I think using those words, in my opinion, is, like, one of the most important parts of, like, progressing people's morals on this subject. Yeah, thank you.
Kelly, I have a question for you. So you're one of the younger people who are here at this conference today. Do you have any advice to the movement generally, how we can engage younger audiences, college students? How can the movement, really get young people involved?
Ooh, that's a good question. Honestly, I would say through social media, like, that's just honestly speaking, through social media, and but I think the movement is doing a good job, and if anyone in here thinks that, like, progress isn't being made, that's just so not true. I feel like, based on just my personal experiences, like, I feel like our generation is so much more, like, empathetic to the cause of just, like, human rights and bodily autonomy and all of those things. All it takes is one conversation, maybe not being like, you're a child abuser, but, like, just being like, hey, like, did you know this, that, and the third? Did you know this about foreskin? Doesn't it kind of not make sense? Just, like, having those conversations with people definitely will make them see a different side to things. I just have a hope, because there is, like, the decreasing circumcision rates. So I just have a hope that it is, like, spreading naturally. I think just through people talking about it, things like older siblings researching it and being like, hey, maybe this isn't the best option. Just the internet has been a huge tool for people to say, I don't have to do this to my kid.
Well, are you ready for me? So I wanted to mention about wording and the different words to use. So I don't know about anyone else here, but when I hear the word circumcision, I get just as triggered and, like, as much as as if I would hear male genital mutilation. Either way, I get triggered either way, because I've equated the two in my head. And because at hospitals they're not going to say, would you like him mutilated? They're going to say, would you like the baby circumcised?
Right.
And the thing is, we need to make the connection between those words.
Right.
And so that's what I've come to. I don't know, anyone else? Like, my heart beats fast, and I'm like, when I hear that word circumcision, I'm like, just as much as I would hear mutilation, because I've made that connection.
Right.
And I think that people need to have that as well, possibly.
I definitely feel the same way, but I don't think everyone else does. I think some people think circumcision is just like, oh, like just something to do to my baby. And they hear mutilation and they're like, that's horrible. And you're just like, please make the connection.
We have a last question here.
Yeah, just more of a comment here that I actually took a class where we talked to somebody about how to win arguments, and it was generic about just all topics in general. And my experience kind of matches that. I've thrown facts and figures to my friends, my family, and damn if I have not been able to save one penis, to be honest with you. Facts and figures are great, but really, from what I learned from that class, is it's stories. Mm-hmm. Stories really help drive home your point. So we can tell facts and figures, but if you tell a story about the guy whose son, who bled to death in the diaper because the child was sent home after an hour, or they got an infection and the penis had to be amputated to save the child's life, something like that. The stories are really what's going to hit home. Facts and figures, especially now in today's age, they're just going to bounce off for the most part, unfortunately. So something to really think about. Try to learn about stories and be able to repeat stories that you've heard in the areas of circumcision and how things have not gone well, as opposed to just the facts and the figures. And I think you'll have much more success.
Definitely agree with that. Thank you.